Just want to welcome everybody to the fourth installment of the Mathewson-Plank Chapter book club series. Today we have with us Keith O'Brien, who wrote a very interesting book on Pete Rose, and Ted New, our chapter member, had the opportunity to meet with Keith out at a Forbes Field Chapters meeting in Pittsburgh recently, and found it inspiring enough for him to go out and read the book. So he asked if he would be able to introduce Keith to us. And so, Ted, it's all yours.
All right, Frank, thank you. As Frank just said, I met Keith O'Brien in early May in Pittsburgh, and he was introduced as the author of several books that were New York Times bestseller. And I'm happy to report that now we can add today's book, which is also a New York Times bestseller. And must be a good one, because I was inspired by the meeting to go out and buy the book, read it, thought it was great. I would say it was the best book I've read in years, but that would be not much praise. But he presented well on it. I'm looking forward to today. I expect Keith to speak for, as long as he feels, but I think he wants to hear what we have to say. So please be ready with questions after Mr. O'Brien finishes. And with that, I'm going to introduce Keith O'Brien.
Thank you, Ted. I appreciate that intro. Good to see you again. And thanks, Scott, and everyone else for coming out this morning and organizing this. I don't know how many folks are right there in Harrisburg. I have been to Harrisburg. It's a lovely place. I was there for one night several years ago, and I remember walking across that bridge to the island where the field is. The Senators weren't in town that night, but man, that was just beautiful. It was just a fun little surprise of a city, and had a great night there. So thanks so much for having me. So like Ted said, I'll talk for a little bit here about my book. I'm going to share my screen, and then I would love to open it up for discussion about this story. We're going to talk this morning, of course, about Pete Rose, but really, I think my book is far bigger than just that. We're going to talk about baseball. We're going to talk about gambling. We're going to talk about a life, frankly, and I want to talk a little bit about process. I feel like as SABR members, we're all interested in telling baseball stories, and for me, anytime I'm telling a story about anything, I want to open the door to rooms that we haven't seen before, rooms that have been dark and filled with dust, places we as a reader, as a fan, just haven't seen. That I feel like is my job. And I feel like I have done that here in many ways with the Pete Rose story. I did it through interviews, I did it through documents, and also, I did it, I think, through photographs. And I think that's where I'd like to start. I'd like to start actually with one of my favorite photos of Pete Rose. It's a photo of him and his 1956 15 and under city champion team on the west side of Cincinnati. Now, there's several things I love about this photo. And the first is, I don't think you need a caption to find Pete Rose in this photograph. He's right there in the second row, second from the right, the small kid with the crew cut. Not every 15-year-old boy looks like his future self. Pete Rose here certainly does. I love that about this photo. I love that all of these kids right here were raised within probably a 2-mile square radius of each other on the west side of Cincinnati. What was then a working class part of Cincinnati still is in many ways. All of these kids went to one of 3 high schools. And if you had shown this photo to anyone in Cincinnati in 1956, 57, 58, 59, and asked them to point out who is going to be the iconic ball player to come out of this team, no one would have pointed to Pete Rose. They would have pointed to the boy standing just behind Pete, the tall boy with the blonde crew cut. That kid's name was Al Luby. And that spring, summer, and fall of 1956, Al Luby was the best player on this team. He was about 6'2" as a 15-year-old. You can see he's towering over the adults in this photo. He was a left-handed pitcher. And that summer in particular, as this team won the city championship and advanced to a national tournament and won that too, Al Luby never loses a game, not one. So, if you'd pointed this, given this photo to anyone in the late 1950s, they would have all said Al Luby is going to be the star here. But he isn't. It doesn't work out for Al in the way it doesn't work out for lots of people who love baseball. And it is the boy sitting just below him who will become the icon. And the last thing I love about this photo is something I think we can all see here, is that Pete Rose looks as if he could be like the kid brother of some of these kids on the team, most of them, frankly. He is significantly smaller than people on this team. And so this notion of hustling, really does begin here, on the west side of Cincinnati in the 1950s. Pete Rose knows that he has to work harder than other players in order to make the team play at all. He's simply not as big. He's also not as talented. He is no Al Luby. And so he knows he has to hustle. And he knows it too because of his father, Big Pete, or Harry Francis Rose, as he was known on the west side. Big Pete, as he liked to be called, was the original star athlete in the Rose family, especially a football player. Harry Francis Rose is a star semi-pro football player in the 1930s, 40s, and even into the 1950s in Cincinnati, at a time when there is no professional football team. The Bengals don't exist. This is as far as Big Pete can go. And from the moment that his first son is born, little Pete, in April 1941, the father is fixated on athletic success for the boy, and really drills into him that he has to work, he has to hustle, and also, takes him to all of his games. This photograph here is from 1947. Pete Rose, the junior, is just 6 years old. You can see him there, right square in the middle, kneeling, the boy kneeling in the middle. His father is all the way over to the right there, number 68, with his left arm on his left knee. You can get a better look at him here. These were games filled with work-a-day men. Men, by the way, who often, wagered on the games, money exchanging hands in the parking lot afterwards as they bet on themselves to win. And so little Pete is there. He is with his father. He is also, I think most importantly, absorbing what his father says. He does not reject the gospel of Big Pete. He practices it and wants desperately, Pete Rose does, to please his father. And so, of course, through many lucky breaks, and frankly, I would suggest at least one miracle Pete Rose, will make it. He is going to make it, as we all know. I don't think I'm going to ruin this story by telling you he will make it. And he reports to spring training, 1963, with a chance of making the big club for the first time after 3 years in the minors. That spring of 1963, Pete Rose is, just objectively speaking, fourth on the depth chart at second base, his position. He is behind the entrenched starter in Cincinnati, Don Blasingame, and he is behind two minor leaguers that you may remember. One will make the majors and have a good bit of success. That man's name was Tommy Helms. And the other man who Pete Rose is behind in the spring of 1963 was a man who just finished his season at AAA San Diego, and that was Bobby Klaus. So Pete Rose is behind all those men, probably not going to make the big league roster in 1963. But something happens that spring that will happen to Pete many times, especially in the early half of his career. He will be chosen. He will receive preferential treatment. And he will receive that preferential treatment because someone likes in Pete Rose something they like about themselves. And in this case, that person is the manager of the Reds, Fred Hutchinson. Hutch, as he was known, was a lot like Pete Rose. He had played in the majors. He had been a pitcher. And Fred Hutchinson had succeeded as a pitcher on grit, tenacity, toughness, a want to. Fred Hutchinson was not, touched, by the hand of God with talent. He got the most out of his talent. And he sees that same thing in Pete Rose and likes that about him. And so by mid-March 1963, at spring training down at Al Lopez Field in Tampa, suddenly Pete Rose is starting at second base, to the sort of surprise of the baseball press. And Pete Rose will start at second base in a game that will matter significantly to his entire narrative. It was March 17th, 1963, a Sunday afternoon game at Al Lopez Field. The Reds were hosting the New York Yankees. These were the preeminent Yankees of the day. This is obviously the Yogi Berra, Mickey Mantle, Whitey Ford, Roger Maris Yankees. It's a big deal. The game is a sellout. Spring training game is sold out in a scene we can't hardly imagine today. People have scaled the light poles in the outfield at Al Lopez Field to get a better view of the field. It is also being televised live back in Ohio that day. And Pete Rose's father is sitting there behind home plate as his son trots out to second base to start the game. And, Pete Rose will play that day with the fury that we will come to know him for later. He leads off as the leadoff hitter, gets on base, scampers all the way around, and scores the winning run, sliding headfirst into home. He will later break up a double play, sliding hard into second base in a practice game. And then to lead off the fifth, Pete Rose drops down a bunt for a hit. And this seems to be, if not the breaking point, then perhaps one of them for the Yankees. And some sort of discussion takes place in the visiting dugout, in particular between Whitey Ford and Mickey Mantle. And the discussion is about how Pete Rose, this kid rookie nobody, is playing. He's playing so hard in this practice game. And what they say exactly isn't totally clear. In the days to come, it will be reported that Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford called Pete Rose Henry Hustle. Other newspapers will report that they called him the Charlie Hustler. And then finally, the press settles on a story that the press likes and says that on the steps of that dugout, Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford had called him Charlie Hustle. And so part of this story is apocryphal. We may never know for sure what they called him. But what's clear is this. It was not intended to be a compliment. They were laughing at Pete Rose. They thought, you know, it was absurd how hard he was playing at spring training. But Pete Rose will do something with this nickname that he will do many times over the course of his career, and I think in some ways is still doing today. He will rebrand this moment and spin it in his favor. And when Pete Rose does make the big league club that spring, which he will, and when he does become the opening day starter at second base, which he will, and when he begins to visit National League cities for the very first time, you know, Chicago and New York and San Francisco and LA, Pete Rose tells everybody the story of the day that Mickey Mantle called him Charlie Hustle because he liked the way he played. And so he spins this story, he rebrands it. And I think it is important to why we will come to like Pete Rose, why we will come to cheer for him, because this story of Charlie Hustle is really, I think, the American story. You know, if you work hard, if you try hard, if you hustle, you can do anything. That is what we tell ourselves in America. That is what we tell our kids and grandkids. And it will make him beloved, Pete Rose, to the point that by the late 1970s, newspapers are running headlines like this without any sarcasm whatsoever. This headline appeared in 1978 in the midst of the Jimmy Carter administration. It was a serious headline and a story about, you know, the unpopularity of President Carter and the possibility of a famous person running for president. Why not Pete Rose? You know, after all, he had, of course, been to the Oval Office, would be there twice in the late 1970s and early 1980s when Jimmy Carter was in office. And he's there, of course, not just because of the nickname, but because he is at that point one of our most famous Americans. I would submit, whether you like Pete Rose or not, you simply cannot tell the story of baseball in the 20th century without him. He is, of course, you know, on some of the best teams in baseball history, not just of the era, but in baseball history, the great teams of the Big Red Machine era. He is, of course, you know, there in 1978 with the epic hit streak that took place that summer, 44 games. Of course, as we all know as fans, this is 12 games shy of the record, and Rose would be devastated when the streak ended in early August 1978. He really truly believed that he was going to blow right past DiMaggio. But I think it's important to point out that this streak, 44 games, is the longest streak we have seen since DiMaggio's 56 in 1941. What is that? 83 years. 83 years is the longest hit streak we've seen. And of course, Rose is there on that warm September night in 1985 when he sets the all-time hit record with that single to left center field off Eric Schau of the Padres. And, you know, I've learned as a journalist to never say never, but it does seem highly unlikely that this hit record, which stands at 42-56, will ever fall. You know, when this season began, the active career hits leader was Freddie Freeman of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And, you know, if Freddie Freeman has the kind of year that he's had for the past 3 years, for say the next 4 or 5, maybe Freddie's a Hall of Famer, maybe. But Freddie starts this season with 2,115 hits, almost exactly half of Rose's total. Freeman is 34 years old. And so even if he were to defy the odds, Freeman, and average 190 hits, what he's averaged for the past 3 years, for the next 10, for the next decade, Freddie Freeman still comes up short by several dozen hits. It just doesn't seem likely that the hit record ever falls. And so he is an icon, perhaps deservedly so. But even while Rose is rising to the top, as he does here, he is making many mistakes off the field. He is sleeping around throughout the 1970s with women outside of his marriage, including this woman here, Terry Rubio, a young woman in Florida with whom Pete will have a child just before the 1978 season began, a child that Rose will not acknowledge for nearly 2 decades. By that time, the late 1970s, Pete isn't even trying to hide Terry Rubio. Terry, who did speak to me for my book, told me that she was booking her travel to meet Pete on the road directly through the Reds' traveling secretary. It is an open secret. And this open secret and this child ultimately leads to a scandal in Cincinnati, the divorce from his first wife, Carolyn Rose, to whom he had been married for 15 years. In the mid-1970s, Carolyn was just as famous in Cincinnati as Pete was. She was, like Pete, extroverted, outgoing, bombastic, a constant presence at the ball games. They were the first couple of Cincinnati. Their divorce in late 1979 will force people in Cincinnati to do what we have to do when our friends get divorced. People on the West Side would have to choose. Were they going to remain friends with Carolyn, or were they going to remain friends with Pete? While all of this is happening, Pete is already gambling and making headlines for it in Cincinnati. Based on my reporting, Pete is gambling with bookies as early as the early 1970s, if not sooner. Fans in Cincinnati would call the front office complaining that Pete Rose was spending too much time at the horse track in Cincinnati, often there before ball games. And again, based on my reporting, by 1975, at the World Series that year, the epic World Series between the Reds and the Red Sox, at least some of Rose's teammates are already concerned about his gambling, his relationships with shady characters off the field. And then, of course, he is ultimately banned for life for these relationships, these choices, his gambling in 1989. So, this to me is frankly just sort of a Greek tragedy. And that's how I began to think of it. This is a tragedy of epic proportions. And it really, in my mind, a Greek tragedy that just happened to play out in and around an American baseball field. I would submit again, whether you like Rose or not, he has lived one of the most compelling, controversial, fascinating lives of any athlete in the last 100 years. And so I want to tell this story. And I want to tell it in a way it hasn't been told before. And so what do I do to start? Well, I return home to Cincinnati. I was born and raised there in the 1970s and 80s. And so I begin my reporting in Cincinnati, not by calling the Reds, not by calling Major League Baseball, not by calling Pete Rose or his representatives. I begin, by interviewing people who everyone in Cincinnati knows are Pete Rose's friends. I mean, Cincinnati is a lot like many small, big Midwestern towns. Everyone's separated by 1 or 2 degrees. And so I begin my reporting by talking to people who everyone knows are Pete Rose's guys, his pals. And it's through them and relationships that I built with them that I ultimately get an introduction to Pete Rose, and was told to call him on a Friday in September 2021. And suddenly I'm in. I'm interviewing Pete Rose. 27 hours of interviews on the phone and in person. Spent 3 days with him in Las Vegas, where he lives, interviewing him face to face. Spent 2 days with Pete Rose out on the road, where he is often brought in to give talks, or in the case of this photo, to christen new casinos. This is Pete Rose placing the very first bet at a blackjack table at a brand new casino in downtown Cincinnati. Of course, the deck was stacked, and Pete Rose does hit blackjack that day. And I was with Rose at his many autograph shows. You know, Pete does, I think, get a lot of criticism for doing autograph shows. And in general, I would say, Pete deserves all the criticism he does get. But I would push back on this particular piece of criticism. Many athletes who you love, who you adore, make a good living out at the autograph shows, signing memorabilia, and in that way are no different than Pete Rose. The only maybe perhaps reason why Pete is different is that unlike his cohorts, he doesn't have a lot of rules. Some of these guys, again, guys you love, have many rules about what they will or won't sign at the memorabilia shows. They will only sign baseballs, or they will only sign their jerseys. They won't sign novelty items. They won't sign their baseball cards. They won't pose for photographs. Pete is totally different. He will sign anything, and I've seen it. He will sign your childhood lamp, your childhood baseball glove. He will even sign body parts. I was with him in late 2021 when he signed this woman's arm here. Her name was Sarah, and she was emotional even while she was in line to meet Pete Rose. She told me that her father had died recently. Her father's favorite player had been Pete Rose, and she intended to have him sign her arm, and she was going to go have this tattooed on her arm that night. And, I didn't know what happened to this woman, Sarah, after she left the autograph show that night. But in the time since my book came out this spring, I have reconnected with Sarah. I met her again at a book event in Cincinnati, and I'm here to tell you that she did have that autograph signed. It is there on her arm forever. So I'm in. I've got access to Pete Rose. He's talking to me. He's answering questions. For the very first time, Pete Rose is speaking to an author for a book, and then suddenly he isn't. The line goes cold. Pete Rose stops calling me back. I don't know why. It was unfortunate, of course. But I had never intended for this book to be built strictly on interviews with Pete Rose. When it began, I didn't even know that I would get access to Pete Rose. I wanted to talk to everyone who had potentially crossed paths with Pete in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And in the time I have left here today, I thought I'd tell you a few of stories of some of those other folks, and then I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. One person I wanted to write about was this man here. His name was Al Esselman, Alphonse Esselman, from the west side of Cincinnati. He was an upstanding citizen of Cincinnati in many ways. He belonged to the Western Hills Country Club. He sent his kids to Catholic schools, drove nice cars. His wife played in the Ladies Golf League at the country club there on the west side. But Al Esselman afforded a lot of those nice things because he was a bookmaker and a gambler and one of Cincinnati's most notorious gamblers. And based on my reporting, by the early 1970s, if not earlier, Pete Rose is betting on sports with Al Esselman. And so, I want to, paint this picture of Al, but he's been dead for many years. And so, I had to interview people who knew him on the West Side, and I set out to interview his children. And I did connect with one of them, and her name was Jackie Esselman Fry. And, I reached her on the phone in early 2022, explained who I was and what I was working on. And Jackie Esselman Fry did that thing that we do in Cincinnati. She asked me where I went to high school. And I told her, I went to St. Xavier High School. And she asked me what part of town I grew up in. And I explained Anderson Township. And Jackie said, well, I lived in Anderson Township for 30 years. And so now we start, asking what street we lived on. And I explained I grew up on Deerhaven, and she lived on Blair House. And those two streets are about, a quarter mile from each other. And suddenly it clicked, and I said, well, wait, Jackie, did you have a son, named David Fry? And she said, yes, that's my oldest. And I said, oh my gosh, Jackie, I'm Keith O'Brien. I went to Immaculate Heart of Mary elementary school, and you took me to the monster truck pool at Cincinnati Coliseum in 5th grade with your son, David. These were reporting, coincidences that happened over the course of my research for this book. My Cincinnati roots did matter. And it wasn't just my Cincinnati roots. It was other connections, in particular, in one case, my own mother. This is a photo of me and my mom in late 2021 at a Walgreens in Northern Kentucky, where my mother was giving COVID vaccination shots. And we took this photo that day because she had just given me my COVID shot. And it felt like a historic moment. I mean, how often do you live through a global pandemic only to later then get a COVID vaccine from your own mom? One thing to know about my mother is that she is like the grandma assassin. She will find out everything about you in 3 minutes or less. And we all know, how long it takes to get those shots at the Walgreens. It takes like less than 3 minutes. But a few weeks later, my mom was giving a shot there to a man named Dave. And she began to ask him questions. And, Dave explained that he was a high school baseball coach. And my mom started asking him about baseball. And he actually said, well, really, I've, been in baseball for 50 years. And she said, really? Well, did you play baseball? He said, yeah, I played for the Reds. And she explained, well, my son's writing a book about the Reds. And this man turned to her and said, maybe your son should talk to me because Dave was Dave Collins of the Cincinnati Reds. And, Dave is, as you can see, a longtime major leaguer, 16 years. But really, never a key player. He's often a substitute, a backup, a guy who platoons, a piece really of the puzzle. But Dave was important to me because, as you can see here, Dave's first season in Cincinnati is 1978. And this year is important. It's not just the year of the hit streak for Pete Rose. It is the year when things begin to start to unravel for him off the field with the child he has out of wedlock with Terry Rubio and with concerns about his gambling. And so, I of course, talked to Dave, spent a lot of time with Dave. And in my interviews with Dave, he told me something important. He remembered a day early in the 1978 season, right around the time when the streak started, he thought, when Pete Rose was missing around the batting cage. This was notable because Pete Rose loved the batting cage. He loved hitting, he loved swinging, he loved the camaraderie around the cage. And so, Dave Collins begins to ask questions. Where's Pete? The story around the cage that day, told by Dave Collins to me and confirmed by other sources, is that Rose was in a meeting up in the president of the Reds, Dick Wagner's office. And this meeting involved Pete Rose, Dick Wagner, and at least one top official from Major League Baseball, the director of security for Major League Baseball. And the discussion that day was about gambling. It was about bookies. It was about debts to bookies. 1978, this is 11 years before we, the public, the fans, will know anything is awry with Pete Rose and gambling. But one person in 1978 knew what was happening, and that man was Tommy Giosa. This is Tommy as a senior in high school in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He was a star baseball player there, second baseman just like Pete, undersized just like Pete. And as a senior, Tommy Giosa bats .570. But to show you how hard it is to become Pete Rose, batting .570 as a senior for New Bedford got Tommy nothing. He was not recruited by major colleges. He was not signed to a minor league contract and ended up playing for a community college in nearby Brockton, Mass. And the only good thing that happens to Tommy while he's at Brockton, Mass, is that they play for 2 years running a springtime tournament for community colleges down in Tampa, Florida. And where does Tommy Giosa stay while at that tournament? He stays at the same hotel as Pete Rose and strikes up an unusual friendship with the man. By 1979, Tommy is no longer playing baseball at the community college. He is basically living with Pete Rose, working for Pete Rose, doing anything for Pete Rose. And he's willing to do that, not just because it's Pete, but because Pete is doing things for him too. Pete Rose helped Tommy Giosa get tryouts with the Phillies, the Orioles, the Blue Jays, and got him a spot on the University of Cincinnati baseball team in 1980, leading to this headline here: Charlie Hustle's back in town. They're talking about Tommy, not Pete. But it doesn't work out for Tommy. He can't catch on with any major league team. He doesn't pan out at the University of Cincinnati. And soon he is just doing Pete's bidding in the shadows, hiding his girlfriends, placing his bets with bookies, and ultimately placing his bets on baseball. And Tommy will make a grave mistake. He will choose in 1989 to protect Pete Rose when Major League Baseball and John Dowd, the special counsel for Major League Baseball, comes after him. Tommy will refuse to speak, and for that, he will pay a terrible price. Tommy effectively was sucked in by the gravitational pull of Pete Rose. And he, by the way, isn't the only one. I would submit that many people, including famous people, are forever defined by one moment, one play, one night, one argument, one wager with Pete Rose. It happened, I would say, to Bart Giamatti, the commissioner of baseball. It would happen, and I would say, to Gene Garber, the reliever who ends Pete Rose's streak in 1978. And it happens, of course, to one other important baseball figure. It happens to Ray Fosse. Ray, of course, was one of the best young catchers in the American League in 1970. Enters the 1970 All-Star game, his first, having hit 16 home runs in the first half of that season. Ray Fosse is on track to hit 30 home runs in 1970. And we all know as fans, if you're a catcher and you can hit 25, 30 home runs, even for 8, 9 years in a row, you're a Hall of Famer, most likely. And so, it's a big deal for Ray that he's made that All-Star game in 1970. And that game was a big deal. 50 million people will tune in to watch that game, July 14th, 1970, at Riverfront Stadium. Only the second All-Star game ever played on artificial turf in a brand new stadium. Riverfront had been open for 2 weeks. They tune in because the game features 24 future Hall of Famers. Some of the biggest names in baseball history are on the field that night. Pete Rose's father is behind home plate watching the game. And so is President Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon will throw out the very first pitch that night from the first row of the seats there, standing next to Commissioner of Baseball Bowie Kuhn. We can imagine something like that happening today. What we can't imagine, perhaps, is Richard Nixon stays for the entire night. The president is there in the bottom of the 12th as the game is tied 4-4, as Pete Rose gets a single, as he advanced to second, and as he comes barreling around third, coming home on a hit from Jim Hickman with 2 outs. And this moment, I think, is significant. Significant for Ray Fosse, significant for Pete Rose. I believe nothing will be the same after this collision at home plate. Ray Fosse is never the same, for the ill. And Pete Rose is never the same for him for the good. I think this is the moment when Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. And, as an author, when you write a book, you can license lots of photos as long as you're willing to pay for them. And there is that famous photo of Pete slamming into Fosse. We've all seen it. You can't even see Rose's face. You see his back. You see the number 14. He's plowing into Fosse as Fosse's glove comes detached from his hand. But for the book, I chose to license this photo instead. The photo was snapped probably about 2 seconds later. Fosse is cratered in the dirt, suffering from a left shoulder injury that will be misdiagnosed in the moment and hurt him for the rest of that 1970 season and maybe beyond. And Rose is standing above him, having scored that winning run. This is, I believe, the moment when Pete Rose becomes an icon, becomes Charlie Hustle. I appreciate you all listening to me and would be happy to take any questions you might have about the book, about Pete Rose, about his gambling, anything at all.
I'd like to go first and just thank Keith for he's 2 for 2 in my book, and what a storyteller. But my question, you mentioned Gene Garber. I'm from Lancaster County. Could you tell us a little bit about the night that Pete Rose's streak is stopped?
Yeah. So I got to say, like I said before, I tried to talk to anyone I could who crossed paths in a significant way with Rose, right? So I wanted to get to Garber. And, Garber is hard to reach in some ways. He's not in the spotlight. He has returned to Lancaster County, where he is a farmer and helps his son farm. I left a couple messages on his what seemed to be a home answering machine or voicemail, and I finally did hear back from him. And I was very fortunate to interview so many people for this book, and I just have to say that I will never forget the 2 nights that I interviewed Gene Garber. He was one of these people who is forever defined by this one moment, and Gene knows it for and it's not for him an accomplishment. I urge you to go look up Garber's statistics. He plays at a time when relievers are starting to be used more often, but it's before they're heralded as key players. If Garber played today, he would have made multiple All-Star teams, and maybe would be like a borderline Hall of Famer. But he plays at this time where they bring him in and he mops up and he pitches 3 innings to close out a game. And Garber's story is just so powerful to me. He's traded to the Braves just a few weeks before the streak ends. He's traded from the Phillies, his hometown team. Garber loved being a Philly. The Phillies were good, in 1978. So they were on the cusp of making the World Series. And Garber was devastated to be traded to the Braves, like the worst team in baseball. But Garber, being a farmer, is willing to do the work. He doesn't, throw a temper tantrum. He doesn't refuse to report. He does what he's supposed to do. He goes to Atlanta and he plays. But when he gets that chance on August 1st, 1978 to end the streak, he wants it. He's brought into the game that night when the game is close. He's a closer. He pitches 7th when the game is close. And then the Braves just pour it on. And I think it's 16-4, I think, in that final inning. And Bobby Cox wants to take Garber out of the game. There's no point in having your closer go out to pitch a 9th inning with a 12-run lead. But Garber refuses to give up the ball. It's almost like if he's going to pitch for Atlanta, if he's going to be traded, if he's going to have no control over his career, he wants this moment. And in a moment that you can really only imagine happening to Pete Rose, a moment of drama, Pete Rose will come up with 2 outs, hitless in the top of the 9th. He's got one last chance and it comes with 2 outs. And you can find this at bat on YouTube. Garber, is pitching Pete, to win, and he's pitching him as he typically would. Garber, as many of didn't throw high heat. He didn't live on the fastball. He preferred to throw off-speed pitches. And he does it in this at bat. But what's critical is Garber falls behind in the count. And he told me, Garber did, that once he fell behind, he was so nervous, he said, that he was shaking because he knew that the worst thing he could do was to walk Rose. How devastating would that be to walk this man with the hit streak on the line? As Garber told me, it was going to be on his record forever if he walked Rose. So he goes to the off-speed pitches. And, Rose will complain later that he didn't get anything hittable. But that's not true. With 2 balls and a strike, Garber's changeup is straight down Main Street. And Rose just misses it. He fouls it straight back to the screen. And once it's 2-2, though, Garber does begin to work the corners. He isn't going to groove Rose anything. And Rose will be livid about that later.
Keith, question I have for you was, Pete would run up these debts with the different bookies. And when it got exceptionally high, he would go and find another bookie and he would kind of stiff the first bookie. Why didn't any physical harm ever come to him?
Yeah. So interestingly, Pete will deny that he was ever in debt to bookies. That's a big sticking point for him. But undoubtedly he was. And the situation you laid out was absolutely true. He would move from bookie to bookie, and based on my reporting and interviews with 3 different men, by the way, who placed his bets on baseball, Rose would incur large debts to these men. Unquestionably, it was different for Pete because of who he was. He was Pete Rose. He was, again, not just an iconic baseball player, he was an iconic American. When he gets deep in debt to a couple of New York bookies in the mid-1980s, 85, 86, 87, based on my interviews with one of his inner circle pals, Mike Bertolini, the man who connected Rose with these bookies, Bertolini had to set up a secret meeting in the basement of a church in Brooklyn to try to establish essentially a payment plan. These guys weren't going to, be stiffed completely. But, one person was worried about Rose's debts, in particular, worried about Rose paying some sort of price for those debts. And that was Dick Wagner, the president of the Cincinnati Reds. Rose, of course, goes to the Phillies in 78, December of 78, signs that big free agent contract with the Phillies, his first free agent contract. And, it was unclear at the time why the Reds didn't bring him back. Both sides, tried to make it seem like the other side had pushed the other away. But again, based on my reporting, there's no question in my mind that Wagner does not want Rose back because Wagner is worried, and he's worried in part about these debts. As Wagner will say later, he worried that someone would come and rough Pete Rose up one of these days, and that when it happened, it would be a stain on the franchise, a stain on the Reds, a stain on the city. And Dick Wagner, who was not like Pete Rose at all, a former military man, had a puritanical streak about him, simply wasn't going to put up with it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's not so much about Rose, it's about Cincinnati.
Yeah.
I read a book about the 19th century. Cincinnati seems to have had a history of that kind of gambling, and some of it was offshored right over the river into Kentucky. I'm assuming a lot of that's gone away now at illegal betting, but is it something that's been betted in Cincinnati, or is it just seems to be a couple of stories in baseball history?
It was absolutely part of the culture in Cincinnati. I think it's also important to point out, gambling was part of Pete Rose's culture on the West Side. His father loved going to the horse track. I find it notable that if you ask Pete Rose what are his favorite memories of his childhood, it's not playing baseball. It's not winning that city title in 1956. He'll say it was going to the racetrack with his dad. A lot of guys on the West Side had bookies in the 50s and 60s. And yeah, you're right. Newport, Kentucky, right across the river. Alphonse Esselman, one of his gambling clubs was in Newport. It was the High Lie Lounge, it was called. And it was a front for gambling. Al Esselman is picked up at one point in the 60s and 70s by federal authorities, the FBI, because he is going across state lines, to run this gambling operation. So the feds used it as an opportunity to bust him on a federal charge. So absolutely part of the culture in Cincinnati. But it wasn't just Cincinnati. I think, in this day and age when most of us can access legal gambling apps on our phones, have forgotten that, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially in blue collar neighborhoods, everybody knew who the bookies were. Everybody knew how to reach them. And lots of people took part in that kind of activity, including Pete Rose.
When Pete got his ban, people often refer to it as a lifetime ban. And I used to think, well, what lifetime of what? The player, baseball, the Hall of Fame? If it's the player, why isn't Joe Jackson eligible? But after reading your book, I went and looked up 21D. And subparagraph 2 says, the last couple words is shall be permanently ineligible. And there's a difference between permanently and lifetime in my book.
Hmm.
So, I mean, what is it? Is it a lifetime ban or is it permanently banned, Keith?
That's a great question. I can't really explain the difference. I think what's interesting to me is that it was avoidable. Whether you want to go permanent or you want to go lifetime, all of this was avoidable multiple times in 1989. One thing I would submit, even as baseball fans, that we, in a great many ways, have forgotten why we ever cared about Pete Rose in the first place. He's become this caricature of himself. And but in 1989, I mean, this was bad for baseball. This was bad for baseball. It devours the season. It wasn't what Giamatti wanted, obviously. It was his first year as commissioner, taking over for Uberoff. If they could have brokered a deal, they would have, and they tried to. But Rose was dug in. He would not admit that he had bet on baseball. He wouldn't admit it early on when all they had was a rumor. At that point, Rose didn't know what they didn't know, neither did baseball. But by late April '89, it's clear to Rose that they got him. Now, there's a 2-day deposition, secret deposition in Dayton, Ohio, in late April 1989 between John Dowd, Major League Baseball's lawyers, Pete Rose, and his lawyers. And at that deposition, Giamatti instructs John Dowd to show him everything. Just lay it all out. I want you to show him all we got, and almost bring Rose in by showing him that they had him. And I asked Rose, why? Why would you continue to lie in that deposition to John Dowd, even as he's showing you, clear evidence that they've got you? And, Rose told me that he was fighting for his life at that point. He was fighting for his livelihood. And the only thing he knew to do at that point was to entrench, which is classic Pete Rose. And it basically paints him into this corner. And it is, I think, a shame for so many reasons. And as you probably know, there's been all these debates over the years. What happens if Giamatti lives? If Giamatti doesn't die, is it different? And I think it is, but for a different reason than most people usually say. A lot of people think that Rose sort of is blackballed after Giamatti's death because he's blamed for his death, and maybe there's something to that. But I think actually the flip side is more interesting. I think if Giamatti lives, the story is different because I believe that Giamatti would have been able to coax Rose out of this corner that he paints himself into. After Giamatti's death, the rules change at Cooperstown. When Pete signs the agreement, the one you mentioned, in August '89, agreeing to that permanent banishment, he believes full well that his name's going to appear on the ballot at Cooperstown 2 years later in 1991. There was no rule that barred ineligible players from being voted upon. As you pointed out, Shoeless Joe Jackson was ineligible. He was voted on for the full 10 years. Rose never gets that chance because after Giamatti dies in February '91, they change the rules. They move the goalposts and they say, hey, only eligible players are eligible for the ballot. It's essentially the Pete Rose corollary. I believe that if Giamatti lives, none of that happens. Giamatti says at the press conference in August 1989, on the day he's banished, he's asked, what are we to do with Pete when he ends up on the ballot? And Giamatti says to the press and on national TV that he will do nothing to change that. They will have an opportunity to vote on Rose as they've had for every player since the beginning of the Hall of Fame in the late 1930s. They could vote on him. And he looked forward, Giamatti said, to seeing how they weighed life and art. But they don't get that chance. And I think that if Giamatti lives, Rose's name does appear on the ballots. I think he doesn't get in those early years because he's lying. And I think at that point, Giamatti probably convinces Rose to come clean. We could have put this to bed 32 years ago.
I have one last question for Keith, and
Yeah.
that's a reference you made to the 11 umpires that were found. Their names were found in the Mater D book in Baltimore in 1972. Whatever happened to them?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Well, was there anything ever come to light of what they were accused of or anything?
No. So what Frank is referencing is in October 1972, just before the 72 World Series between the Reds and the A's, authorities busted a maitre d' at a restaurant at Little Italy in Baltimore. And, I think it's important to note that, most bookies in the 60s, 70s, and 80s had some connection to organized crime. They were either fully enmeshed in it or on the fringes of it. And so when they bust this bookie in Little Italy in Baltimore, it's reported a few weeks later, not right away, that in the search of his home, they found a notebook with the names of 11 major league umpires. Again, in '89, Giamatti, Fay Vincent, and John Dowd pull out all the stops to find out the truth about Pete Rose, and rightly so. But they don't do that in '72. They sort of wave their hands in the air and make this go away, and we never know what happened. And I think it's somewhat ironic, that 52 years later, I think we've been in a similar situation this year. Listen, all the evidence to date, suggests that Shohei Ohtani was not involved in gambling in Southern California, that it was Ippei Mizuhara who was placing those wagers, and only Ippei. But I would say that there are holes in that story that you could drive a battleship through. And no one, not the press and not Major League Baseball, seems interested in exploring those massive holes in that story.
May I ask a question, Keith?
Yeah.
First of all, I want to say that was a really well-written book, tremendous book. Thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you, Carmen.
I actually have, believe it or not, the day the New York Post said Pete Rose suspended from baseball, I have that signed by Bart Giamatti and Fay Vincent, because they got on a plane after I did, a private plane, and the pilot got him to sign that.
Oh,
I bet I could go
God.
to Vegas. I could go to Vegas and probably get Pete to sign it if I paid him enough.
You have to. He will absolutely sign it. You have to get that signed. I got to tell you, Carmen, he will sign anything. And I don't mean that in a negative way. He has signed copies of the Dowd report. He has signed copies. Yeah. He signed photographs of the bar that his bookie Ron Peters owned in Franklin, Ohio. He will sign anything. So he would probably get a kick, actually, out of signing that newspaper.
Right. I'd be afraid he'd rip it up in front of me. But okay. I do want to say a couple of things that fascinated me was his focus when things were all kinds of crisis, how well he did on the field during those moments. That was terrific. That fascinated me from his personality. And also, I was always opposed to Pete getting in the Hall of Fame. Now that baseball has basically embraced gambling to the point that it's gotten ludicrous, your book still makes me a little wary. The thing is, when they say he hasn't given us a sincere apology, yet he has apologized, what do you think why do you think people are saying it's not a sincere apology? What else can he do besides what he's doing now to apologize? I mean, does it just seem like, okay, he's only doing that to get in the Hall of Fame, but how could you have a sincere apology unless he, crawled down the street in Cincinnati self-flagellating somehow. What do you think would constitute a sincere apology that people would accept? What would he have to do?
Yeah, great point, Carmen. I mean, so I think as context, I think there are three problems that build up to your question. The first is, his lies for 15 years hurt lots of people. It hurt the memory of Bart Giamatti. It hurt Fay Vincent. It hurt baseball. It hurt the Cincinnati Reds. It hurt everybody. It hurt people close to Pete Rose. Pete Rose wasn't just lying to you and me and Fay Vincent. He was lying to his closest friends. People told me, his closest friends told me that they were stunned in 2004 when his book came out, where he finally admitted that he had bet on baseball and the Reds and reversed 15 years of his own narrative. His closest friends were blown away. That's one. Two, that book, in 2004 is the classic sort of mealy-mouthed apology. Baseball was upset, not just he reversed himself after 15 years, but that he published the book right around the time where the Hall of Famers were announced, sort of upstaging. I think it was Eckersley and someone else. They were upset that, I'm sorry, go ahead. Who was it again?
Molitor?
Yeah, I think that might be right. Anyway, they were upset about the timing. They were upset that he was cashing in with $1 million book deal. Again, I don't begrudge anybody from, writing a book that's going to get you paid $1 million. I think that's fine. But people were upset about that. And then I think the last thing is, and he did it in the book, but he still does it to a certain extent today, he can't just fully embrace the story. It's always, yeah, but I'm with you, Carmen. I mean, what is a sincere apology? Who are we to judge the sincere apology? How do we really know? I think the reality of the situation is Pete Rose is not wired like most people, for good or for ill. His particular wiring, I think, led to many of his mistakes, but his particular wiring, to your point, Carmen, led to his success and his iconic status. So, we want him to apologize in a certain way. We want him to go on Oprah and cry and weep and, hold his hat in his hand. He's not going to do it. It's not how he's built. And so if we're waiting around for that, we will be waiting around forever. And I think the whole thing just gets into, for me anyway, just gets into the subjectivity that I personally don't like about any Hall of Fame. I personally believe that we should vote people in for what they did on the field, between the lines. It is truly the only thing we know for sure about these people. We just don't know that much about our most famous athletes. I think we're going to know even less about them going forward at a time when reporters have less and less access to the biggest stars. And so, I think we should vote people in based on what they did on the field. And then if what they did off the field is so wrong, let's put it on the plaque. Let's put it on the plaque at Cooperstown. Put those mistakes there right next to their accomplishments. But we're not going to do that, I don't think, because if any of you have been to Cooperstown for these induction ceremonies, we have turned them into the canonization of humans. 100,000 people come out, standing ovations, 30-minute speeches carried live on TV. We parade them down the streets like minor gods. And if the qualifications to be in the Hall of Fame is to be a minor god, then most people aren't qualified to get in, and Pete Rose certainly isn't. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, Ted just put in the chat what he thought, right, Ted?
Oh yeah, but to Keith's question, what do you guys think? I polled on Facebook the Baseball Reliquary, 225 votes. This was just this week. 41% say he should be in. Now, just to let you know what that means, this is answering Keith's question, it would take the next 306 votes to be for him to get to 75%.
Well, Baseball Reliquary, you talk about the group out in Pasadena. They're a fun offbeat type of group. I mean, they have
I know
their own
that,
little
and very
Hall of Fame.
knowledgeable, and that was their opinion.
Oh yeah, if you ever have a chance to go to one of their convention or one of their inductions, it's hilarious. Yeah, no, they're a terrific group. I'm surprised they didn't even go higher.
You know, it would have been fascinating, you know, when they changed the rule in February 1991, the press, the baseball writers were upset, and not just because they wanted to vote for people, but because the vote was being taken away from them. And of course, there were a lot of stories written. And in one of those stories, Sparky Anderson said something that I think is notable. He said he thought it was a mistake that they had barred Pete forever. And he said because we'd never be able to vote on it, this was going to hang over baseball forever. And Sparky was wrong about a lot of things. I think Sparky, in a lot of ways, enabled Pete Rose in the 70s. Sparky was well aware of some of Pete's questionable relationships. Sparky and Pete were good friends. But Sparky was dead right about this. And I think it would have been fascinating to have the vote. I mean, we've seen it a million times over the years, right? You know, where a player, you know, who's on the border for some reason, you know, starts off by only getting 60% of the vote or 50% of the vote. And over the years, the discussion changes as we evolve, as the discussion evolves. We never got to have this conversation about Pete Rose, just a hypothetical conversation. And because of that, it's like this whole moment is just sort of encapsulated in amber, you know, forever.
Keith, one thing that people have brought up, which you did, was, and even the steroid guys, Barry Bonds, is let them in and then put it on the plaque. But if you did that on the plaque, I mean, my God, you'd have to go through everybody. You have to put Ty Cobb as a rampant racist. John McGraw enjoyed dog fights. Mickey Mantle was an alcoholic. I mean, you would.
No, you would.
I don't know how you could keep going, but you know, it'd be kind of hard to do.
You absolutely would. And again, it's a fun hypothetical conversation. But which of these athletes, you mentioned some of them, modern athletes today would agree to that? You think Barry Bonds is going to agree to be inducted into the Hall of Fame and then have something about, you know, performance enhancing drugs put on his plaque? No freaking way. No way. So it's a fun thought, but there's no way it happens in reality. And as you pointed out, it's a slippery slope. But that gets back to sort of the big question. Are we enshrining people in any Hall of Fame because of the life they lived, the person they are? Or are we enshrining them because of the art they created, their product, their performance on a field or a court? You know, when you start conflating the two, it gets messy really quickly. And I think notably for about the first 45 years of the Hall of Fame, 45 or 50 years, voters didn't spend any time discussing the moral quality of these players. It was strictly about their performance on the field, and that changed. That began to change in the 1980s, and we're still wrestling with that today.
Don't you think that's Watergate? The earlier writers hid all the faults of Babe Ruth and all those people. Then you got to the Watergate era, and it was open. I mean, Baseball Hall of Fame and baseball in its history was created as a moral, a you know, something for young boys, American boys to look up to. I think Watergate probably changed. So the Hall of Fame is caught, I think, somewhere in the middle of where it was created to be this model for youth, into now when we are basically flaws and all don't, you know, are different or looked at differently. So you're stuck by the NBA and the NFL Hall of Fame and what has traditionally been the MLB Hall of Fame. And I do think you see younger writers kind of putting aside the idea that character doesn't matter. I mean, by the votes they put for people who are obviously steroid users, but who got at least 50-60%. I don't think that would have been true 20 or 30 years ago.
I think you're right. Watergate's a great point. I think Watergate and the changes in media, how media operated, how media covered anything, is relevant to the discussion. And you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, the voters in the 70s, you know, and the 80s, you know, knew the foibles of the guys they were voting in. They just chose to ignore it. They chose not to talk about it. They didn't tell us about it. The fans, they didn't write about it, and they didn't include it as part of their voting. But it is interesting, right? Like, they were protecting players back then, and we were lionizing guys who didn't deserve to be lionized. But now we are sort of, I think, inconsistently, you know, applying sanctimony to the votes we make, and choosing who is qualified as a moral person and who is not. And we simply just don't know. We do not know. I mean, listen, reporters just don't have the access today that we used to. And while that was sort of a negative in the 50s and 60s when these guys were protecting them, in the 80s and 90s, they were learning things, seeing things about players that were relevant. And now, you know, you get your 5 minutes with a star athlete in a press conference with 30 other people. That's it. You know, we just don't know what's going on behind closed doors.
I think for the sake of time, we probably ought to just take one more question yet and respect Keith's time here. So if anybody has one last question they want to ask.
I don't have a question, but I just want to make a statement. I had not read the book because I read a lot of Pete Rose books, and I'm thinking, oh, you know, I have never been a big Pete Rose fan, but yeah, this conversation and Keith does here. I mean, I'm going to go buy the book. So this
Mike.
is going to be different from all the other, because, you know, there are a lot of Pete Rose books out there, and I've read them all. This really sounds like this is done differently. And so, yeah, I'm going to run out and get it. So yeah.
I can guarantee you the quality of the writing is much better than most of the baseball books you're going to find. So
good read.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mike. Thanks so much.
Thank you for coming. Thanks for making
it was my pleasure. It was my pleasure, guys. Great conversation. Thanks for having me. And if anybody, you guys have been so gracious. If anybody wants and hasn't gotten a Pete Rose bookmark, email me and I'll send you a Pete Rose bookmark in the mail. I've got I made them actually myself. I made these Pete Rose bookmarks, and you can read all of your books going forward with Pete Rose, as you should, right? We should read all of our books with Pete Rose.
Now, will you sign it? I'm sorry, he bet on baseball, or don't think he heard me. Okay.
Oh,
We lost.
Thank you.
Thanks,
hey, thank
Keith.
you, guys.
Thank you.
See you later. Have a great
Thank
Saturday.
you. Thank you, Ted, for setting this up.
Okay.
All right.
Just a quick reminder to everybody on the call, hot stove meeting Thursday, the 15th of August, 7 o'clock.
We can pick up this conversation again.
Okay. Did we stop recording?
Yeah, thank you again, Ted. That was great. Ted, that
Okay.
was terrific what you did there, getting him.
Yeah, this was really good.
Yeah.
Oh no, the book is terrific. Book is terrific.
It was.
Really is.
I couldn't have cared less about Pete Rose, but I mean, this book was really good. Really, really good.
Yeah. I'm going to grab it now. Yeah.
Yeah. Did we stop recording, Scott?
I think